In the quiet winter of 1960, the snow in Ashridge Hollow muffled every sound. Time seemed slower there, held in place by old oak trees and fading clapboard houses. It was in one such house, at the edge of the hollow, that Mary Caldwell stumbled upon a letter that would fracture everything she believed about truth, memory, and blood. Mary was not from Ashridge Hollow. She had grown up in Pittsburgh, raised on concrete and steel, but her grandfather's death had brought her here. He had left her the family's ancestral farmhouse, dusty, cold, and filled with forgotten things. She arrived one evening with a suitcase, a flashlight, and no expectations. What she found was a home haunted not by ghosts, but by something far more unsettling. The attic had been nailed shut, not locked. Nailed as though someone wanted to seal away whatever lived inside. Curiosity got the better of her, and by the third day she pried it open. The air was dry and tasted of wood rot. Boxes were stacked like little tombs, and old furniture was draped in moth-eaten sheets. It was there, between a chest of baby clothes and a rusted cradle, that she found the letter. It was tucked inside a hollowed-out Bible, its paper yellowed and brittle. The handwriting was cramped, frantic, almost feverish. It read, "Do not let them bury the truth. They were born together, yet time disagreed. One came first and the other followed, a year later. But they were never meant to be apart. Never." Mary sat down slowly, rereading the words until her breath clouded the cold attic air. Twins, born a year apart? It didn't make sense. And yet, something about it felt real. She had always heard strange family stories growing up, about madness, about a woman who spoke in riddles, about children who weren't quite right. No one talked about it directly, but now, with this letter, a thread had been pulled. She searched through the rest of the Bible and found an old census sheet tucked into the back cover. The names were clear: Elias Elbert, born December 29, 1852, and below that, Emery Elbert, born December 29, 1853. Identical surnames, identical birth dates, except a year apart. Twins, but not. Her heart quickened. She looked again. The handwriting on the census was elegant and official, not a clerical error, no scratch-outs, no smudges. The birthplaces were the same: Elkridge Farm, just outside Ashridge Hollow. There was no doubt. 2 boys, 1 year apart, both born on the same day. The deeper she looked, the stranger it got. Newspaper clippings from the 1860s mentioned the Elberts as a quiet, religious family. Then, around 1865, they vanished. No sale records, no obituaries. It was as if they had been erased. That night, Mary couldn't sleep. She lay awake, the attic's letter burned into her thoughts. Who were the Elbert twins? What had happened at Elkridge Farm? Why had the family been so obsessed with silence? If you're fascinated by true tales that bend the boundaries of reality, don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this one. In the morning, Mary packed a small satchel and drove toward the town's library. The snow had begun to fall again, gently dusting the rooftops and curling down the winding country roads. Ashridge Hollow looked peaceful on the outside, like a postcard trapped in time. But beneath the surface, something old stirred, something that had waited over a century to be heard. The Elberts were not just another forgotten family. There was something buried with them, something strange. And Mary Caldwell had just taken the first step toward uncovering a truth that had been deliberately hidden, one piece of paper at a time. Elkridge Farm lay tucked between 2 low hills, its fields bending with the wind like golden ocean waves. In the spring of 1850, Amos Elbert purchased the land for a modest price: 40 acres of fertile soil, a weathered barn, and a house that had seen better years. He and his wife Beatrice arrived by wagon, bringing with them a Bible, a mule, and the burden of leaving Ohio behind. Amos was a man of few words and many routines. He tilled the soil before sunrise, spoke little during meals, and kept his faith tightly stitched to his chest. Beatrice, in contrast, had a voice like wind chimes and a gaze that never quite settled. She was a pastor's daughter, raised to believe in Scripture but prone to dreaming. While Amos worked the land, She filled her notebooks with strange prayers and songs half-remembered from her grandmother's tales. Their marriage was quiet but stable. Days passed with the rhythm of labor, planting, mending, harvesting, storing. They didn't need much, but what they wanted, what Beatrice wanted, was a child. For 5 years her womb remained silent. The women in Ashridge Hollow spoke kindly but pitied her. Beatrice kept to herself, rarely venturing beyond the church steps. In 1852, everything changed. One morning in March, she collapsed near the chicken coop. A local midwife confirmed what Beatrice already suspected. She was with child. The months that followed were filled with hope and unease. Beatrice grew distant. Her dreams became vivid. She would wake in the middle of the night, eyes wide, muttering words in languages Amos didn't understand. He chalked it up to the pregnancy and said nothing. But the neighbors noticed. That winter came early. Snow fell before the last of the harvest was brought in, and by December the farm was buried under drifts. On the 29th, Beatrice went into labor. The pain was fierce, lasting through the night and into the next morning. The midwife, an elderly woman named Hester Dunn, arrived on horseback just before dawn. By candlelight, Elias Elbert entered the world. He was quiet at first, his skin pale blue, but with time and warmth he let out a strong, defiant cry. Amos held him, eyes wet with something between awe and fear. Beatrice looked at the child with a strange stillness. Something about her expression unsettled Hester. It was not joy, it was not exhaustion, it was recognition, as if the child was already known to her, as if she had seen him before. 2 nights later, Hester returned to check on them. Elias was swaddled and asleep. Beatrice sat in the rocking chair unmoving, humming a melody that didn't belong to the church hymns. Hester asked if she was all right. Beatrice didn't answer. Then came the winter silence. Hester never returned to Elkridge Farm again. When neighbors asked Amos about the baby, he would nod and say Elias was strong, thank the Lord. But he never brought the child to church. And Beatrice stopped attending altogether. One night in early January, Amos was seen digging in the snow behind the barn. No one asked why. In Ashridge Hollow, some questions were best left unanswered. The only thing anyone could agree on was that something had changed. Amos seemed colder. Beatrice stopped singing. And though no birth was recorded in the county registry, the midwife's notes found years later confirmed it. Born of frost and shadow, the mother named him Elias. But in truth, something else had been buried that winter, something Amos would never speak of again. The following winter arrived like an echo. Same snowdrifts, same biting wind, same eerie silence that wrapped Elkridge Farm in its frozen grip. Life on the property trudged forward, but something inside the house had shifted. Beatrice wandered its narrow halls like a shadow, often barefoot despite the cold, whispering verses no one else remembered. Amos worked harder than ever. From dawn until the moon rose, he rarely spoke. At church, when people asked how the baby was doing, he'd nod curtly. "Strong," he'd say, with the same hollow tone each time. No one had seen the child since birth. No one had been invited inside. And then on December 29th, 1853, 1 year to the day, Beatrice screamed. The neighbors heard it just before midnight. A long, shrill wail that cut through the trees like a blade. Hester Dunn, the old midwife, clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders and closed her curtains. She had heard that sound once before, and it had haunted her dreams since. That night, no one dared venture to the farm, but by sunrise the whispering had begun. She had another child, someone said. "No one carries for just 12 months, another replied. "Maybe the first never lived. Maybe this one shouldn't have." Rumors twisted through Ashridge Hollow like smoke. The Elberts, already peculiar, became a fascination, cloaked in dread. Children dared each other to sneak close to the property fence, to see if the devil himself had taken root in that cursed soil. None dared cross it. Inside the farmhouse, Beatrice cradled a newborn. "Emery," she whispered over and over. His skin was warm, his cry healthy. She rocked him by the hearth, eyes distant, as if seeing something beyond the walls. Amos stood in the doorway, silent. He hadn't called for Hester this time, hadn't called for anyone. He just watched his wife with a look that didn't quite fit joy or fear, something in between, something raw and lost. 2 sons, one named Elias, one now named Emery, born a year apart to the day, both on the 29th of December. But even as Emery's lungs filled the room with life and unease set into the air, Beatrice was not the same. She would hum lullabies in 2 tones, as if singing to 2 children instead of 1. She prepared 2 cribs, though only 1 was used, and sometimes in the dead of night, Amos would find her staring at the empty one, smiling faintly. He asked once, "Why the second cradle?" Her eyes flicked to his, calm and unreadable. "For the other." "The other?" "The one who left too soon." Amos didn't ask again. Outside, the townsfolk spun tales. Some said the Elberts had lost their minds. Others believed in darker things, curses, spirits, unnatural births. A few whispered about old folk rites passed down through Beatrice's family, tales of bargains and blood. But none dared accuse them aloud. Ashridge Hollow survived by silence, and silence was safer. Over the next months, Beatrice rarely left the house. Emery thrived, soft and bright-eyed, cooing in his mother's arms. Yet neighbours claimed to hear laughter echoing from the fields at dusk, 2 voices, not 1. They said shadows moved where no one walked, that animals shied from the Elberts' land, and the whispers deepened. 2 boys, they said, but only 1 born this year. 2 cries in the dark, 2 names, 1 secret. Something didn't add up. Not to the midwife, not to the townspeople, and certainly not to the records that would later baffle Mary Caldwell. A second birth on the same day, a year apart, too perfect to be coincidence, too unnatural to ignore. And in the stillness of Elkridge Farm, the truth waited. It always had. Back in 1960, Mary Caldwell leaned over the library's heavy oak table, her fingers tracing the brittle edge of an envelope sealed long ago and never delivered. It had been slipped into a hollow book of psalms, hidden between pages, yellowed by time and forgotten faith. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable, delicate, looping, almost trembling, Beatrice Elbert. The letter inside was unsigned, undated, but it breathed with urgency. Mary read it slowly, her lips silently shaping the words. "To whom it may concern, I fear I have done something terrible in the name of love. What is born may not be made, and what is made may not remain. Elias was the light, but something dimmed it, and then came Emery, not by nature, but by need." Mary froze. The phrasing sent a shiver through her spine. Not by nature, but by need. She reread it again and again, trying to make sense of what Beatrice had written. It was more than poetry. It was confession. But to what? Further down, the lines grew more cryptic. "I begged him to return the soul. I pleaded through night and ash, through blood and scripture. They told me it couldn't be done, but I heard the wind whisper otherwise, so I opened the door." There was no explanation of what door or to whom she had pleaded, just a single chilling sentence at the end. "One soul torn, one vessel split. They cannot last this way." Mary leaned back, exhaling slowly. It was madness or prophecy. But most disturbing was the echo of that phrase in other documents she'd unearthed. In a dusty journal kept by Father Whitman, the old church pastor from the 1850s, she had seen the same sentiment. They are 2, but 1. The repetition wasn't coincidence, and the more she cross-referenced, the more questions surfaced. She found census entries with no parental details for Emery. School records listed Elias in 1 year, Emery in the next, but with no gaps in age, no change in grade level. Identical attendance marks, identical teachers, no twin confirmation, no explanation. Just 2 boys, both described the same way. Pale, quiet, intelligent beyond their age. Yet no photographs existed, no birth announcements, no church baptism records for either. It was as if both boys had emerged in isolation, untouched by community, unblessed, unverified. Mary scribbled notes furiously. Her heart pounded as she considered what this might mean. Could Beatrice have lost a child and convinced herself he was still alive? Or worse, had she tried to replace one child with another through some forgotten ritual? The language in the letter hinted at something older than grief. Words like pleaded through ash and begged for return weren't metaphors. They felt like descriptions, ritualistic, primal. Mary, a historian by training, recognized the cadence. It mirrored Appalachian folk prayers, the kind whispered in secret before the church ever reached the mountains. Beatrice hadn't just mourned her son. She had tried to bring him back, and in her desperation something had answered. Mary sat in silence for a long time. The room around her was still, the only sound the low hum of the overhead lights. On the table lay 3 items: the torn letter, the census page, and a faded map of Ashridge Hollow showing the old location of Elkridge Farm. They formed a triangle: past, confession, and place. And somewhere in the middle of that triangle, the truth waited. She stood, gathered the papers carefully, and tucked them into her satchel. Her mind buzzed with more questions than answers, but she felt a strange pull, a quiet certainty that whatever had begun in that house a century ago was not yet finished. Outside, the sky had turned slate grey. Snow began to fall again, slow and deliberate, like ash drifting down from a long-dead fire. Ashridge Hollow, in the eyes of the world, was just another speck on the Pennsylvania map. It had no industry, no great tragedy, no reason for fame. But for the people who lived there, its silence was intentional. They didn't forget by accident, they forgot by choice. Mary learned that quickly. She began asking questions at the diner, the post office, the church. Each time she mentioned the Elberts, faces stiffened, lips pursed. Conversations shifted like wind through dry grass, abrupt, evasive, gone. Old Mrs. Hargrove, who had lived on the edge of town since before the Great War, said only, "That name's not spoken here, dear." Let it be. The local pastor, Reverend Delaney, was more direct. That family brought sorrow. Let the Lord keep their secrets now. But Mary wouldn't let it go. She had names. She had dates. She had something stronger than rumor, records. The town, however, had built a wall of silence over a century tall, and its foundation was fear. The only breakthrough came in a forgotten church archive, tucked in the back room of a near-abandoned chapel. She had to pry open the drawer with a crowbar, the wood swollen from decades of moisture. Inside were dozens of dusty ledgers and journals. Most were sermons and attendance logs, but one stood out. A black book, small and leather-bound with a broken clasp and a name etched on the inside cover. Reverend Gideon Whitman. He had served Ashridge Hollow from 1847 to 1859. Mary flipped through the pages expecting doctrine or scripture. Instead, she found confession, detailed, stark, unfiltered. There were entries on townsfolk disputes, strange illnesses and farm mishaps. But in late 1852 his tone shifted. The Elbert woman is with child at last. Yet something in the air feels wrong, as though something other than joy has entered her house. In January 1853 he wrote again, "I visited their farm after the birth. The boy, Elias, was quiet, too quiet, not like a child. He stared through me." And Beatrice, her eyes had changed, as if she'd traded something in the dark. Then came the December 1853 entry. A second child, she says, Emery, but no one had known she was again with child. No swelling, no preparation, just a second cry on the same day, 1 year later. The boy is real, I held him, but I do not understand. I do not believe this is natural. Whitman's entries continued with a rising desperation. They are two but one. I see it in the way they move, in the way one finishes the other's thought. There is a tether between them, not fraternal, not divine. Something made. I warned them. I told Amos to bring the boys for baptism. He refused. Said they were born clean. I don't believe they were. Mary closed the journal, her hands trembling. The town hadn't forgotten. It had buried. She looked out the chapel's cracked window at the street below. Families walked in peace. Children played. Old men rocked in silence. None of them spoke of Elias or Emery. None of them dared. The Elberts had been erased, not because they were unremarkable, but because they were unforgettable. And Mary now held a thread that tugged at the seams of the town's carefully constructed denial. She packed the journal into her bag and made a list. Schoolhouses, land deeds, burial records. She wouldn't stop here. Whatever had happened at Elkridge Farm had terrified an entire town into generational silence, and silence, she realized, was never innocent. Mary didn't sleep that night. She sat by the hearth in her grandfather's house, the journal of Reverend Whitman open across her lap, each page more unsettling than the last. This wasn't folklore. It was a first-hand account, and every word rang with the tone of a man wrestling with something he couldn't name. The entries grew darker as she read deeper. February 1854. I heard them again last night. The cries from Elkridge. But they were not infants' cries. They were layered, like one voice over another. It chilled me, though the fire still burned. April 1854. Emery does not speak yet, but Elias speaks often and sometimes in voices not his own. I heard him recite Latin this morning. His mother has never read such texts, nor has the town taught him. And yet the words flowed like water from a spring. Mary underlined that line, Latin, in a child not yet 2. The next entry was nearly illegible. The ink was smeared as though by a shaking hand. June 1854. I fear I have watched a miracle twist into a mimicry. The boys, yes, there are 2, share more than a face. When Elias stares into the flame, Emery blinks. When Emery cries, Elias touches his chest, startled. I told Amos. He told me never to return. But Whitman did return. Mary read on, transfixed. August 1854. Their mother is fading. She does not sleep. I found her walking the road barefoot, murmuring a name I did not recognize. Her eyes were open, but she was not awake. October 1854. Today, Emery looked at me and said, "He doesn't like you." I asked who. He pointed at his brother. Elias said nothing, but he smiled. December 29th, 1854, 1 year to the day. I stood at the edge of their land and watched smoke rise. Not from fire. From something colder. Amos met me at the gate. His eyes were red, but not from weeping. He said the boys were fine. But behind him, I saw 2 shadows move, and only one body. Mary's breath caught. 2 shadows. 1 body. The phrase from Beatrice's letter came back to her. 1 soul torn, 1 vessel split. The journal continued, but the tone had changed entirely. January 1855. The town grows restless. There are reports of animals going missing, of strange marks in the frost. I've been asked to intervene, but I'm no longer certain what faith can do against whatever this is. March 1855. I asked Beatrice to explain what happened the night Emery was born. She would only say, "I asked for my son," and something kind answered, but it didn't come alone. Mary closed the book gently. Her fingers tingled, her mouth dry. This wasn't merely a matter of birth records or genetic mystery. Reverend Whitman had documented what he believed to be a spiritual fracture, something beyond medicine or science. The twins weren't just born a year apart. They were bound by something unnatural, something invoked. She thought of the way townspeople avoided eye contact when she mentioned the Elberts, the way even public records seemed to bend around the family. Ashridge Hollow hadn't forgotten. It had protected itself through a mission. Mary rose from her chair and walked to the window. Outside, the snow had stopped, leaving the ground glassy and white. Her reflection stared back at her, small, determined, and now part of something far older than herself. She turned back to the journal and whispered aloud the final words Whitman had written. "If they are 2, but 1, then what happens when the other wants out?" Elias Elbert, from the earliest accounts Mary uncovered, was not like other children. By the age of 4, he could read fluently. Not just simple texts, but passages from his father's old almanacs, obscure theological writings, and even medical volumes Beatrice had kept hidden in the cellar. His voice carried a precision beyond his years, clipped and cold. Teachers marveled at his intellect, but rarely smiled in his presence. He rarely smiled either. His classmates described him as watchful, never cruel but never warm. He didn't play. He observed. If others laughed, he tilted his head, as if trying to understand what joy was and why it happened. It wasn't shyness, it was distance, like he stood on the far edge of some invisible barrier the rest of them couldn't see. Then there was the matter of the drawings. An old schoolmaster's ledger, recovered from the basement of the first Ashridge Hollow schoolhouse, included samples of student work. Most were simple, farm animals, trees, flowers. But Elias's were different, intricate, repetitive. He drew circles within circles, patterns spiraling inward, and always two figures, one black, one grey, joined by a long coiling thread. In one drawing, the grey figure held a mirror. The black one had no face. Elias told the teacher, "That's me, and that's the other me." When asked what he meant, he blinked once, then said, "He watches when I sleep." He was 7 years old. Mary closed the ledger with a heaviness in her chest. What had it been like growing up with that presence always near? Had he known from the beginning that something was wrong? She found another entry from a different teacher years later. Elias Elbert does not blink when spoken to. He stares so intently it becomes unnerving. During a spelling test, he stopped midway and asked, "If my brother feels pain, does it still belong to him, or do I carry it too?" But what frightened the townsfolk most weren't his questions. It was how he seemed to know things he shouldn't. The location of lost tools, the exact time before a thunderstorm arrived, the contents of locked drawers. And then there were the shadows. Several reports, mostly dismissed as folklore, claimed Elias could be seen in 2 places at once. A boy swore he saw him by the river, skipping stones. At the same time, the teacher saw him in class. One woman claimed she saw him standing perfectly still behind the church pulpit after Sunday service, unmoving, eyes wide, while his family was already walking home. When confronted, Elias said nothing. But once, according to the records of a former pastor's wife, he whispered as she passed him, "Sometimes the other one walks when I don't." Amos remained silent through it all. If he saw the signs, he gave no voice to them. Beatrice, on the other hand, had grown frail and secretive. She carried Elias's old clothes in a satchel, even as Emery wore newer ones. She often sat in the barn alone, humming tunes with no melody, as if trying to keep something at bay with the mere sound of her voice. The boys, though, were never separated. Whatever Elias was, brilliant, strange, unreachable, he was always at Emery's side. And when Emery fell ill, Elias would sit beside him through the night, his small hand resting on his brother's chest, as if anchoring him. But it wasn't affection that people remembered. It was the stillness. The way Elias's eyes wouldn't leave Emery's sleeping face. The way he would whisper words no one else could understand. And sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, Elias would speak into the empty corner of the room, as though someone were answering back. If Elias was the cold, Emery was the warmth that balanced it. Where Elias watched, Emery participated. He laughed easily, cried often, and wore his heart on the outside. He was soft where his brother was sharp, full of questions that didn't seek power, only understanding. At school, Emery sat beside Elias but was the one who drew attention. He made friends. He comforted classmates. He once gave away his lunch to a boy who'd been punished for misbehaving, saying, "It's okay, I can share with Elias. He never eats much anyway." The teacher found that odd. Elias never touched his lunch. One afternoon, Emery scraped his knee during recess. Before anyone could help, Elias flinched from across the yard and clutched his leg. He fell hard, though he hadn't moved from the bench. When asked what happened, he muttered, "I felt him fall." It wasn't the only time. Neighbors told stories of Emery waking up screaming, only for Elias to appear seconds later, silent and pale, whispering calming nonsense in the dark. Once, during a Sunday picnic, Emery burned his hand on a coal ember. Elias's hand turned red minutes later, without ever touching the fire. They were connected by more than blood, that was clear. But the way Emery described it to those he trusted was even stranger. "It's like we're the same shadow," he told his teacher, "but sometimes I feel like he wants out of it." He was 8 when he said that. Beatrice, increasingly brittle in health, clung to Emery with desperate tenderness. She would brush his hair for hours, murmuring lullabies from her own childhood, her eyes lit only for him. She once told a neighbor, "Elias is the reason, but Emery is the gift." Whatever that meant, she never explained. As the years passed, Emery began showing signs of something else. Sensitivity not only to Elias but to the emotions around him. He cried when animals were sick. He grew anxious during storms, not from the thunder, but from the feeling that something was being disturbed. He said he could hear trees groaning, hear the places where the world used to be louder. He wasn't unstable. He was attuned. The town began to see him as the gentle twin. Teachers favored him. The pastor once said, "That boy carries a sweetness the Lord himself must have kissed into him." While Elias drew fear, Emery drew affection. But the connection between them remained unnervingly strong. In one winter incident, Emery became inconsolable during a church service. He said something was wrong. "He's hurting," he cried. "I can feel it." Moments later, Elias was found outside behind the church, having fainted in the snow, nose bleeding, eyes rolled back. The doctor could find no explanation, but the connection had left a mark. Elias grew more distant after that, Emery more tender. One seemed to recoil as the other reached out. Still, they were inseparable. It wasn't a choice, it was necessity. One seemed to exist only fully in the presence of the other. Mary read these records with a growing ache in her chest. It wasn't just unnatural, it was tragic. Emery, from every account, had been light in the truest sense, radiant, intuitive, deeply human, but tied to something he neither chose nor fully understood. A teacher's letter tucked into the Elberts school file put it best. "Emery feels like a boy trying to hold the sun in one hand and a ghost in the other, and I fear he doesn't know which one he's supposed to let go of." Mary folded the letter carefully, as if handling a fragile relic. The more she learned, the clearer it became. The Elberts had not raised 2 sons. They had tried to contain a bond that should never have existed in the first place. And somewhere in that house, buried under the years and snow, was the secret of how that bond had begun. It was the summer of 1865 when the peace in Ashridge Hollow cracked, just slightly, just enough to let the fear breathe again. Elders Creek, a narrow ribbon of cold water winding through the eastern fields, had always been a favorite place for the local children. Emery and Elias often went there, accompanied by other boys from the area, though few dared to venture too close to them. Even among children, instinct overruled curiosity. That particular day was bright. Emery had laughed loud and free as he splashed water onto a boy named Samuel Hurst. Elias sat nearby on a flat stone, unmoving. His clothes were dry. His gaze, as always, was distant. Then something changed. According to Samuel's account, Emery had climbed out of the creek to dry off when Elias stood abruptly and walked to the edge of the water. He stared at Emery for a long moment. Then, without a word, he reached out and shoved him back in, hard. Emery hit the water face first. He didn't resurface. At first, the boys thought it was a prank. Then they heard the thrashing, saw the bubbles. Samuel screamed and leapt into the water. Elias made no move. He stood there watching, eyes empty. Samuel dragged Emery out, coughing and blue-lipped. It took minutes for him to breathe again. When he finally did, he wept, not from pain, but from something else. "He said I'm not the real one," Emery sobbed. The boys carried him home, drenched and shaking. Word traveled fast. That evening, 3 fathers knocked on Amos Elberts' door. They wanted answers, wanted to know why a child had nearly drowned another. Amos said nothing for a long time. Then he closed the door. The next morning, the Elberts were gone. Gone, not packed, not moved, gone. Neighbors found the house empty, furniture still in place, dishes on the table, beds unmade, a small fire still smoldered in the hearth. But no sign of Amos, no Beatrice, no boys. It was as though the earth had opened up and taken them back. Some say a wagon was seen heading north the night before, 2 lanterns swaying in the dark. Others claim they heard voices chanting in the woods behind Elkridge, low, slow, broken in rhythm, but no one investigated. Not seriously, not loudly. What remained were stories and silence. Emery was never seen again, nor Elias. But what truly unsettled the town were the prints found near the creek the next day. 2 sets of footprints walking side by side, until suddenly they became one. Mary read the reports with a quiet horror. The drowning had nearly broken the tether. That much was clear. Elias had done more than push his brother into a stream. He had declared something, a judgment, a sentence, or perhaps a revelation. "You're not the real one." And the silence that followed was not mere absence, it was protection. She found an old article in the local register from months later. A passing mention of the Elbert property being sold to a traveling preacher who refused to sleep inside the house, choosing instead to sleep in a tent on the edge of the woods. When asked why, he simply said, "Something in there still speaks." Mary folded the clipping, her hands cold. The boys had been inseparable until that moment. The bond that had kept them linked, tight and unrelenting, had finally cracked. Elias had tried to break free, but from what? Or from whom? From... As she stared into the candlelight flickering across the old documents, she couldn't help but wonder, was Elder's Creek just a creek, or had it been something else that day? Something ancient, watching, waiting for the moment when one soul would try to cast off the other. For decades, nothing. No trace of the Elberts, no sightings, no letters, no graves. Ashridge Hollow quietly erased the family from its memory, locking their story behind thick silence and dusty records. But the past doesn't stay buried, not when it carries a name. In 1901, a patient was admitted to the Ridgehaven Asylum for the Disturbed, 70 miles northeast of Ashridge. His intake papers listed his name as Elliot Barnes, age unknown, no family, found wandering the outskirts of a burned farmhouse muttering about threads and mirrors. Mary discovered the file buried in a box of misclassified asylum records donated to the State Archive. The moment she read the intake form, her breath caught. Elliot claimed to have been born on December 29, 1852. That wasn't all. When questioned, he spoke in riddles. He referred to himself in plural. "We came, we were born, we split." Nurses reported he would stand in corners, whispering to reflections, refusing to sleep in any room with a mirror. If moved to one, he'd scream for hours until unconscious. He never responded to Elliot, but when someone, out of frustrated guesswork, called him Elias, he turned, looked the nurse in the eye, and said, "You found me." He remained at Ridgehaven for 37 years. During his 3rd year, a doctor named Samuel Keene conducted a series of interviews with him. Keene's notes, preserved in brittle journals, painted a disturbing picture. The subject claims to be half of something once whole, describes being born full and then ripped, states that she asked too hard so they gave too much, consistently refers to a brother, Emery, but insists he was made, not born. When asked about his parents, the subject wept for the first time, repeated, "She gave me her soul so he could stay." Mary reread that line again and again. "She gave me her soul so he could stay." Beatrice, she flipped to later entries. Patient described a ritual, ash in a circle, breath in a jar, a name spoken backward, a promise made. Refused to say to whom the promise was given. Said, "I only remember the voice." It said it could return what was taken, but there was a cost. In 1919, Elias, or Elliot, was found unconscious in his room, uninjured but unable to speak for 3 days. When he recovered, he said only one thing: "Emery is gone." He never spoke again. He died in 1938. The official cause, heart failure. But the final doctor's note read, "At the moment of death, his shadow doubled in length." The nurse swears she saw a second hand on the bed rail. No prints were found. Mary sat back, the pages trembling in her hands. Elias had survived, or at least part of him had. He'd lived long past the world that remembered him, trapped inside his own mind, haunted by something that had once shared his breath. And Emery, gone. Vanished without a trace, not just from Ashridge, but from Elias's very soul. She closed the journal and looked up at the pale ceiling of the archives. There were no accidents in this story, only choices. Beatrice's desperate plea, a child born too quiet, a second cry the world never asked for, and a man who lived too long with a voice not his own whispering in the corners of his mind. The shadows had followed Elias to the end, but even then they hadn't left him. Mary knew now that what happened at Elkridge wasn't just a tragedy, it was a fracture, a tear in something sacred, and somewhere in the hollows between those broken pieces, the truth waited still, unseen, but not unheard. Mary had begun to think she'd reached the edge of the Elbert mystery, that the final echoes of the story had faded with Elias's death in 1938. But fate doesn't always end with a death certificate. Sometimes it leaves one last whisper in the dark. In a private collection stored in a university's special archives, she found a folder labeled Anonymous Ashridge Correspondence. It had been misfiled, tucked among 19th-century shipping manifests. Inside were 7 letters, all unsigned, written in childlike cursive. The archivist said they'd been donated decades ago by a local historian who found them behind a wall in an abandoned house near Elkridge Farm. The handwriting was shaky, the paper faded, but the voice, gentle, fearful, pleading, felt unmistakably familiar. Mary read the first letter. To whoever reads this, my name is Emery. I don't know if I'm real. Mama says I am. Papa doesn't look at me. I think maybe he sees someone else when he does. My brother is quiet, but not in the way people mean. He's not empty. He's full of things. Sometimes he talks to me, but not with words. I feel what he means, like wind under a door. The second letter was shorter. Elias told me once that I wasn't born. He said I was made. But Mama cried and said that wasn't true. She said love makes all things real. I want to believe her. But sometimes I wake up and I'm cold and Elias is watching me like I took something he wants back. Mary's hands tightened on the paper. The emotion in Emery's words was raw, untouched by time. These weren't fantasies, they were glimpses into a boy's fight for identity. The third letter. I remember the night Mama did the circle. I wasn't supposed to be awake. She cut her hand and whispered my name, but I hadn't been born yet. I think maybe that's when I started. The implications struck Mary like ice. Beatrice hadn't simply mourned her son. She had summoned something, a ritual, a plea, a name whispered before its time. The fourth letter. I love my brother. I do. But I think I wasn't supposed to be here this long. Sometimes I feel myself fading when he's angry. Like I'm slipping behind glass. He doesn't mean to hurt me, but he wants to be alone inside again. The fifth was almost illegible, splotched with ink, or perhaps tears. I'm scared. Last night, I felt something pull, not from the outside, from me, like something stretched too thin. Mama held me and said not to let go, but she's tired. So tired. I don't want to disappear. Mary paused, pressing her palm to her chest. She imagined the boy writing these letters, hiding them, hoping someone might one day read them and know he had existed, not as a shadow, but as a soul. The sixth. I think Elias is getting stronger. He dreams with his eyes open. I saw myself in his dream once, but I was on fire. He said, you shouldn't be here. I think maybe he's right. And the last letter. If someone finds this, tell them I tried. I tried to be good, to be real, to be whole. I'm sorry I made Mama cry. I'm sorry I made Elias break. I didn't ask to come, but I loved them. Even when they couldn't love me back. No signature, no date. Just the weight of a boy who'd never had a birthday party, a family photo, a place in history. Mary folded the final letter with reverence. For the first time, Emery had spoken for himself, not through whispers but through his own trembling words. He had loved, he had feared, and most of all he had existed. Somewhere in the hidden spaces between the pages of forgotten ledgers and burned houses, Emery had carved his name, not into stone or wood, but into memory. And now, someone had finally remembered. December 29th, 1852. The night the first cry pierced the snow-heavy silence of Elkridge Farm, something else moved beneath the surface, something no one saw but Beatrice, That cry belonged to Elias. But it wasn't the first sound of that night. According to a forgotten page in Father Whitman's private notes, buried beneath fire-damaged pages, there had been a stillness before the birth. Not quiet, stillness, a heavy, charged hush, as if the very house held its breath. Beatrice had gone into labor alone. Amos was in the barn, unaware. The wind howled outside, rattling windows, and then silence. She delivered the child herself. He did not cry. The boy, pale, unmoving, was swaddled in blood and snow. His chest did not rise. His eyes were shut tight. For over an hour, Beatrice held him, rocking back and forth on the wooden floor, whispering broken prayers. She refused to accept death. Not after waiting so long, not after dreaming his face 100 times before he existed. That was when she turned to the books, her grandmother's words, the things said in hushed tones behind the preacher's back. Prayers older than Scripture, names older than God, things not meant to be remembered. But Beatrice had remembered them all. She drew the circle in ash. Her own blood used to mark the edges. She whispered the name she had chosen, not for Elias, but for what she had lost. Then she made the promise. Mary, reading these accounts pieced together from Whitman's recovered journal and annotations in Beatrice's Bible, felt her skin prickle. This wasn't grief. It was invocation. Beatrice hadn't asked for resurrection. She had asked for return, for restoration. She didn't want a second son. She wanted the same soul brought back. And something listened. The breath returned. The child's eyes opened. He screamed. Elias was alive, or so she thought. Father Whitman, summoned 2 days later to bless the child, noted that the moment he entered the house, his vision blurred. He felt watched, oppressed. He wrote, "The boy was warm, healthy, yet there was something layered beneath him, like a voice beneath a voice. His cry was not alone. I swear I heard 2 tones." I left shaken. Beatrice never told Amos what she had done, but from that day forward she kept the ritual hidden in the drawer beneath her prayer cloths. The circle, the chant, the vow, the knife. It wasn't until a year later that Emery arrived, but Mary now understood he hadn't come from the womb, not entirely. He came from the promise. The night of December 29, 1853, Beatrice had felt the pull again. Her body had not swelled. There had been no midwife, but something inside her awakened, as if called by the thing she had summoned a year prior. And when she screamed in the darkness, it wasn't from pain, it was from awe and fear. Emery was born with the same face, the same hands, the same heartbeat, but softer, lighter, quieter. A split. The price had not been paid in blood, it had been paid in balance. One soul, torn, half placed in Elias, half given form as Emery, neither whole, neither false, but both incomplete. The ritual had not resurrected, it had divided. Mary sat alone in the archives, the pages spread before her like broken glass. She saw it now, the terrible symmetry, 2 births, 1 year apart. One soul forced to fracture so love could be answered. Beatrice had been willing to pay anything, and in her desperation she had unwittingly crafted a living paradox, a boy made of grief and longing, and another bound by the weight of being too much. The tragedy hadn't begun with Emery's vanishing. It had begun the night Beatrice reached beyond the veil and was heard. By the time Emery was 10, the signs were undeniable. He was growing fainter, not in body but in presence. Teachers began to forget he was in class. His name was sometimes left off roll books without explanation. A neighbor swore she saw him vanish behind a tree and never reappear. His voice, once bright and melodic, became soft as breath on glass. Elias, meanwhile, grew heavier in the room. People felt it. He spoke less, but when he did, his words lingered. His gaze unsettled even grown men. Something was changing, shifting between them. Mary found a record from a retired physician who had treated both boys in their early teens. The doctor had noted, "Emery appears healthy yet lacks weight. Pulse is present but faint. He grows cold easily, often describes dreams of floating." Elias, by contrast, is robust, grounded. But his temperature runs high. He refuses to be examined together with his brother. That detail stuck with her. Elias refusing proximity. They had once been inseparable. Now the bond frayed. And Beatrice? Her body aged faster than her years. She took to bed for days, clutching an old shawl that once belonged to her mother. She murmured prayers not heard in church, calling on names long buried by civilized faith. Amos, long silent, began to drink. The house at Elkridge grew darker. Then came the winter of 1866. According to town records, the pastor had visited the Elberts after rumors circulated that the boys had not been seen in weeks. The pastor found only Amos at the table, hands trembling, face hollow. When asked where his children were, Amos said, "They're choosing." The pastor, confused, asked again. Amos looked up with eyes like cracked stone and repeated, "She made the world hold both, but it won't hold forever." The journal of Father Whitman, by then already hidden for years, had described this same choice, not in plain words but in riddles. A vessel split cannot last. One must return. The stronger decides, but the weaker remembers. A soul cannot serve two hearts forever. Mary pieced it together. The ritual that birthed Emery had not been a clean gift. It had been a balance temporarily tolerated by the world, unnatural, held only by Beatrice's will and the twin bond. But time wore down even miracles. The boys were one soul in two forms, and the strain was growing. One had to remain, and the choice was not Beatrice's anymore. She found the final entries of Emery's letters scrawled on torn fabric, likely written when no paper remained. "He's hurting. I know he doesn't mean to, but I feel him pulling, like he's sinking and dragging me with him. I love him, I do. If it comes down to it, let him stay." Mary wiped her eyes. There was no hero here, no villain. Only two halves trying to share a breath too small for both. In the final pages of the family Bible, beneath the family tree, someone, likely Amos, had written, "Emery, 1853. No death date, no burial, just a question." As if even the father didn't know what happened, or couldn't face it. But the town did. It knew. It sealed the house, spread stories of illness, and moved on. It buried Emery in silence, not from cruelty, but from fear of inviting the past to speak again. Mary placed the documents in order, her thoughts circling one phrase Emery had written, "If it comes down to it, let him stay." The world had not taken him. He had let go, and in doing so preserved the fragile edge of reality his mother had once dared to cross. Mary stood once more at the edge of Elkridge Farm, now little more than a scar in the landscape. The foundation of the house still existed, jagged stones like teeth protruding from the ground. Nature had reclaimed the rest. Vines crawled over collapsed beams, and the old well was sealed with rusted iron. But the silence remained. She wasn't the first to return, she learned. Over the years, others had ventured to the ruins, historians, thrill-seekers, even descendants of those who had once whispered about the Elberts behind closed doors. They all left with stories, not about ghosts, but about something stranger. Children reported hearing music under the wind. Our teacher once claimed her son woke from a dream describing a boy who asked, "Do you remember my name?" A hiker found two handprints in the frost, one small, one identical but inverted. These were dismissed as folklore, remnants of a past no one wanted to validate. But Mary had the documents, the letters, the confessions. She had pieced together a narrative buried beneath denial. And now she faced the question no one else had dared ask. What do we do with truth that doesn't fit the world? Publishing was the obvious choice, but the consequences weren't. She compiled her research, over 1,000 pages, photographs of journals, transcriptions of letters, scanned entries from Father Whitman's notes, census discrepancies and asylum reports. She titled the document simply, "The Elbert File." When she submitted it to a regional historical journal, it was rejected. Too speculative, they said. Too supernatural. When she shared it with a local paper, the editor refused to print even a summary. He told her quietly, "That story's been buried for a reason." The silence held, but not everywhere. Online forums picked it up. A podcast did a feature. A folklore researcher requested copies. Then came messages, small at first. A woman in West Virginia who remembered her grandmother warning her never to speak the names of the mirrored boys. A man in Vermont whose family kept an old charm in a box labeled E. Elbert, 1853. Children in Ashridge, even in 1960, still dreamed of twins who walked the woods at dusk. Something had survived. Not the bodies, not the farm, but the imprint. Mary walked to the place where the barn once stood. There, between two broken boards, she found it. A scrap of cloth, faded blue, the kind once used for boys' shirts. It was unremarkable, yet when she touched it, she felt an ache that wasn't hers. And just beneath the cloth, buried in dry leaves, was a single page. Torn. Water-stained. It read, "They say I wasn't meant to stay, but I think I was meant to be known." No name. But it didn't need one. Emery. The boy who had not been born, but had lived, who had loved, who had let go, and who now lingered. Not in form, but in memory, in whispers, in the half-remembered lullabies still sung without knowing why. Mary brought the cloth and page home. She placed them in a glass case beside the Elbert file, now archived in her own small library. The town still did not speak of the Elberts, but children still dreamed, and Mary Caldwell had ensured that forgetting them would never be so easy again. Because some truths do not belong to belief, they belong to remembrance. Mary Caldwell returned to the attic one final time. The floorboards creaked beneath her steps, familiar now, worn by months of searching. The dust had settled again, but the air was different, less oppressive, more like a held breath just released. She approached the old chest, the one where she had found the Bible, the letters, and the first echoes of Elias and Emery. Inside there was nothing new, nothing waiting, except a single change. Two cradles stood side by side. They hadn't been there before. One was deep brown, the other grey, simple, unadorned, empty, but nestled inside each was something small, fabric scraps, faded blue and pale cream, and tucked between them, folded precisely, was a note on fresh paper. She reached for it, her fingers trembling. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the message was unmistakable. We were always one. She whispered the words aloud, and for a moment she could almost hear the echo of two voices saying them in unison. Downstairs the wind shifted, not loud, not cold, just present. Mary took the note and placed it gently in her satchel. She didn't need to ask who had written it. Some truths arrive without origin. They simply are. She knew now that the story of the Elberts wasn't about twins. It wasn't about a haunting, or even a curse. It was about love taken too far, a mother who begged the world to give her child back, and when the world answered, it asked for nothing, yet demanded everything. It was about identity blurred by grief, torn by the impossible demand of being whole in two places. It was about Emery, the boy who gave up his place in the world for a brother he loved. It was about Elias, the child who bore too much, memories that weren't only his, pain that split his mind. And it was about the silence left behind. Ashridge Hollow would not speak of the Elberts. But Mary had spoken for them. She had written, preserved, remembered. The attic door groaned as she closed it behind her, leaving the cradles just as she'd found them. Not as relics, but as monuments. Later she would publish her findings, not in a journal, not behind paywalls or academia, but openly. A printed manuscript, mailed to libraries, schools, archives. A digital version, free to all. She called it, The Forgotten Truth About the Elberts. Their twins were born a year apart. And the world listened. Slowly. Quietly. People began to talk. Some doubted, some believed, but many simply felt something when they read the final page. Like they'd once had a dream they couldn't remember, a name they'd forgotten, a shadow behind glass. Years later, a little boy in Ashridge Hollow stood outside the woods behind the old Elbert land. He stared into the trees, unmoving, while his mother called to him. When she finally reached him, he turned and asked, "Mum, if someone was never born, but you still remember them, does that mean they're real?" She didn't know what to say. But that night, she dreamt of two boys sitting quietly on the edge of her bed. One smiled, the other nodded. And in the morning, the wind through the window carried a song she couldn't name, but felt like home. If this story gave you chills, and you want more forgotten tales brought to light, don't forget to subscribe for more. And if you're ready for another journey into the unknown, click the video on your screen now. The truth may not be done revealing itself.